Once again, we're here at the end of the semester, and so let's just speak to our experiences of speaking, writing, and learning in the electronic apparatus or the electronic environment that we are now largely functioning within. And so, post-production. Post-production we talked about, and all of us exhibited a really nice use of post-production. I saw Facebook posts, I saw Twitter feeds, I saw the manipulation of Instagram videos and posts. I saw numerous videos emailed to me in compact formats that displayed a hypertext, and so a text, audio, and visual and video components that were sent directly to my email. I also watched a number of videos posted on YouTube to a live public platform. And so good job, kudos to you, to those of you that presented your speech in a slightly more public manner. And so this is really communicating in the public sphere. This is also exhibiting an understanding and a use of post-production techniques. And so what communication and what public speaking used to be, which was speaking to a present audience and manipulating and using nonverbal elements of communication along with symbolic codes such as language, is now available online and in electronic environments, which uses a host of post-production elements. And so as we move forward in the communication field and in society, think about how these use of these different elements of communication help us learn in different ways and also communicate different messages. We are almost like directors now. I have the ability to put hypertext and text onto the screen. I have the ability to set up my surroundings and direct the settings slightly more than we would in a live situation. We have Prezi here at the top, we have Instagram here at the bottom, and so we are also subject to some of the corporate and technological platforms that we are using, but this is very similar to live environments where that setting and that context always comes into play as a communicating and mediating factor. And so post-production, excellent job. Editing electronic media, video, image, voice, and text. I really enjoyed some of the music that was going on in the background of some of our presentations, the news-like feed of the text that would pop up in the right-hand corner, some of the filters, some of the stars, and accents that would come up on some of these videos. The laugh track was very interesting and just shows how we are simulating mediated audiences and preparing to speak to a larger audience. And so because we are both speaking and recording, it's very similar to what we used to think of as writing. And so writing and speaking are merging slightly closer together within the electronic apparatus. And within the Western paradigm, philosophers and thinkers spend years deciphering the difference between the two as we moved from orality to literacy. And now we exist in an electronic environment where orality and literacy merging slightly closer together. And so what does this constitute? This constitutes a widening of the public sphere and how we communicate within the public sphere. The foundation, it is the foundation of democracy, as we've noted many times. The public sphere and our notion that our public voices have an impact within society is the foundation also of communication and rhetoric. And so what does this entail? This entails the awareness of what does it mean to write? What does it mean to speak? And what does it mean to communicate publicly now in an electronic apparatus? And so those narratives are now changing. And we're at the forefront here in the communication field of looking at communicating within the electronic public sphere as an indelible skill that one might need, and also constitutes a little bit of um, literacy understanding, or literacy, I should just say, for lack of better words. And so here's the question for extra credit points here. How has learning and thinking changed in this electronic setting? And so how has communicating, learning, and thinking changed within the electronic apparatus? And so what has changed for you? It's kind of like going online and finding a book. You often go online and find a book. If you went to the library or bookstore and found a book, you would find that book, but then you would see all the books that got you there on the way towards that process. At the same time, when you're online, you can pull up various other books or look up other content as you were searching for that book. And so the two, the live and the virtual, very similar, but each context encourages different types of thinking, different types of learning, and they change the messages that we are receiving. And so now we receive that book in both settings, but the content is slightly changed because of that. And then we go on to read the book in its paper format or in its electronic format. And so how has learning and thinking changed in this electronic setting that we have now experienced for the second half of the semester, this semester? This is the extra credit question. For those wanting to learn more, of course, sign up for communication courses. Now that we are largely looking as a global community at electronic forms of communication and learning, we're at a very interesting point here where communication skills become that much more salient and important. And so, of course, sign up for communication courses or choose communication as a major. It is a field that is really right parallel with the unfoldings of society. We are constantly exploring how important communication is and how vital that link is between the symbol and reality. And so the symbol of reality and reality itself, the two are just intertwined. And as we unpack them and understand them, this is a pursuit of communication studies. And so the sophists are just very interesting characters from ancient Greece. They traveled, spoke, and taught rhetoric, noting that our worlds could be altered via our words. And so that symbol that we attach to the things, if we want to change the thing, well, we can go out and actually change the thing itself, or we can just change the word that we use to describe the thing. And then we all look at the thing or things differently. And so reality, as the sophists noted, was equal to perception. And so remember, Plato and Socrates, who were more into a universal understanding of the truth, noted that our perceptions lie. The sophists might say something a little bit more like our perceptions are the truth. And so the way that we perceive things are the way that we see things. If you had a negative experience with a dog, and you are scared of dogs, and you see a dog, you react viscerally, and you're just not comfortable around dogs or fond of the animal. And so your perception is that reality to you. That dog is potentially harmful or vicious to you, and they're not that way to everybody. And so the sophists noted that if we want to change reality, we can change perception. And furthermore, if we want to change perception, we can change the words that we use to describe things. The vicious attack dog, the cuddly puppy, right? Just change those words, and now you're changing the nature of the thing. You're changing the nature of how people perceive the thing as well. And so orality and writing, I think, is something that's really interesting here. If you want to respond to this question of how we learn and think differently in the electronic apparatus, you might think about orality, oral speaking, and writing. And so what's going on right now is that I'm speaking, but this is being recorded, and you can retrieve this at a later date. And so it's somewhat similar to writing. And that's why we speak about kind of closing the gap between orality and writing. And so talk to me about that. Let me know what your thoughts are on the difference between orality and writing as it arises within the electronic apparatus. Once again, excellent work, everybody, producing an online or electronic version of your speech. Just very interesting topics. Also very interesting public displays. Making your own jewelry, going to flea markets, playing music, making food, working out, playing video games, just be very interesting when discussed as public displays of our societal values. And so I really enjoyed these. I particularly enjoyed the one with makeup, and the before and then after, and then some of the internal effects that go on to makeup. I also really enjoyed the video game public display, just a commentary as we're watching a video game narrative unfold, just very interesting. For the persuasive speeches, just interesting topics that dealt with language, culture, the prison industrial complex, and many other social inequalities that we have in society today. Unfortunately, social inequalities are most likely not going anywhere anytime soon. And one of the ways that we remedy some of these social inequalities is through communication. And remember, rhetoric was devised originally to overthrow oppressive governments in a peaceful way. And so it's still the way that we change society. If you think of every great social movement in history, they've all coalesced around a discourse or a rhetoric about how to change reality and a logic of why we should change that reality. And so, excuse me, shout out. Orality is a presence. And so as we start to conceptualize speaking in its live sense, you might think about why speaking is different than writing and what happens between the two forms of communication. And so orality is a presence. You have to be present in traditional orality, right? Public speaking. And this is something that we had to contend with when we moved to online environments. We were very kind of nervous and apprehensive about how we're going to speak publicly without anybody around. This is largely the way that we function in today's society, where we are engaged in public speaking, we are engaged in orality, but there is no physical audience around. And so the audiences become mediated and become fragmented. And so orality equals presence. There's a presence at work in traditional orality. What about writing? Writing is a distance. And so when you read your writing, the author is no longer there. The author is no longer speaking. And so there's a distance, a separation between the message and the context from which the message was delivered in. You ever write or read something that's written down that starts off with, I was in a dim cafe that was empty and sunlight shine through the far window and a person walked up and you're describing the context. It feels like you're in the scene and you're bringing people into the world in which apparently you were writing. But nobody knows if you're actually in a cafe and you're not actually there speaking to somebody. And so there's a distance in writing. The two are inherently connected. And they both entail a manipulation of a code. And so there is much more of a connection than many scholars attend to. And that is that we are both dealing with a code that we are manipulating called language. And it's just one of the codes that we are using in any given communication context. And so once again, how has learning and thinking changed in the electronic apparatus? Socrates and Plato, of course. As the sophists noted the importance of rhetoric and public speaking within a participatory society, they traveled around and taught this now necessary skill of a democracy. Plato comes along and starts to write down everything that Socrates is saying. And remember, Socrates never leaves Athens and he never writes anything down. So Plato comes around, writes down the dialogues between Socrates and sophists for the most part. And so what we see here is an oral engagement that turns into a more of a written objectivity. And so that's somewhat of the difference between speaking, engaging, and engagement. If you are tuned into this live, then you are, we are somewhat simulating that live presence of a live speaking moment. And so we are engaged here. And as the words linger and the words were written in the past, right? This is somewhat more of a written objectivity, Socrates and Plato. That is up to you to what that means. Now, if I say my two dogs, Socrates and Plato, I'm referring to Socrates and Plato, my two dogs, and you know that, and you're aware of that now. If you read this and you have two dogs named Socrates and Plato, then maybe you might make that connection. But everybody is going to make their different connections from this written objectivity. And so you can see that the words are a little bit more objective when they are written. They are detached from that context and that source, although, of course, they are placed in a new context. So speaking in electronic formats alters the orality of messages slightly. And so writing it down on screens becomes what happens to speech in the electronic apparatus. Now this speech is encoded onto the screen. If we can go in as a computer programmer might and break it down, we would physically see the writing. We would see the electronic code that is now enabling this voice and my image to be captured. And so this is speaking in electronic in electronic environments, which slightly shifts the orality of messages, making them a little bit more similar to traditional writing. And so speaking in electronic apparatus now has distance. Now you can transport this message to others. You can record yourself and transport that presence. Now, is it an actual presence in the traditional sense? Not so much, but it is a little bit more present. And so this is some of the difficulties and some of the benefits that we have been negotiating as we've gone online. And I will say once again that everybody did an excellent job producing a speech in the electronic apparatus. There's a digital divide. Those that do not have access to digital media suffer because of that. those that do not know. And so there's somewhat of a generational divide as well. Those that did not grow up with smartphones or the ready availability of electronic forms of recording might struggle a little bit more in this environment, in this setting. And so very similar to functioning and learning and communicating within traditional spheres, those that weren't allowed to go to college or didn't have access to university classrooms or even a university that was nearby or K through 12 suffered because they did not have access. And so all of these things that we were challenging before are here now and challenging now, but they are, of course, slightly different. And so writing in electronic formats remains a distant code, but becomes slightly more present, closer to a particular engagement, i.e. a text, an email, or a video clip that has writing on it. And this is still writing, and it is still a distant code that is slightly more objective. It is also the pinnacle, the harbinger of truth in our society. And you think about the ways in which in society, and this might be another question, how do we privilege the written word? A written contract, put it in writing as a phrase, a sign that's somewhere, do not enter, no trespassing, right? Seems to have a little bit more validity than someone saying you can't go in there, right? It might not be a law, but we think of it as a policy, and policies and laws are also written down. And so you might think about how we privilege the written word in our society, and what happens to this privileging when we function in the electronic apparatus. Now we sign electronic documents and we receive bills and correspondence electronically, right? And it alters the power or the strength a little bit of those textual correspondence. And so even when we typed a paper and sent it in, it had a little bit more of an immediacy. It came to me a little bit quicker, and I might have read it slightly quicker and outside of a certain context. Just that handing in of a physical paper is different now in the electronic apparatus. And so that writing in electronic apparatus remains a distant code, but moves slightly closer to one's context, which is interesting. I can type right now and send this out to you, and it becomes very much like speech. It's like writing on a board in a classroom. And so orality and literacy in the electronic apparatus. The emphasis, the ability to record. I really enjoyed people's recording and editing, and then disseminating. And so those three things that we do within traditional public speeches, we write and devise the outline, we practice, memorize certain excerpts, and then we deliver it. And that delivery is such an emphasis within face-to-face communication. And the delivery, for the most part, is probably what gave people a lot of stress and which was difficult to overcome. As I'm preparing to speak this lecture, a majority of the difficulty comes with setting up this camera, going online and making sure that my voice and my likeliness will come through to the perceived audience. It's also a little bit of a cognitive dissonance that occurs with who I'm speaking to, my perceived audience. And so we might think about how we perceive that society at large. And now this is really more of an internal process. And I think that's very true for a lot of our endeavors, that we are now internalizing an audience. We are contemplating a potential context that is out there that is not right in front of us. And so we have to trust words now. We have to trust writing. We have to trust the news trust our ability to trust or not trust various news sources. And so our understanding of the public sphere, and the public sphere is constructed by our own messages and our own actions, right, has to be understood in a much more internalized way in this environment. And so when we're thinking about our experiences producing messages within the electronic apparatus, think about how you were perceiving the outside world, how you were perceiving potential audience members. And like I said, I think that everybody just did an amazing job. It was really exciting to see how younger generations are dealing with the various mediated platforms that we have to work with, and some of the elements of these mediated platforms. And so words, at one point, the written word was a new thing. It was amazing and surprising. I could write something down, pass it over, wait a week, and somebody else would receive it. The same thing is true now, when we can fade in from one scene to a next scene and put up a filter over here or an image over there, right? These are new elements of communication, and we use them for various means, just like all elements of communication. The shift occurs in the use of various communication codes. And so writing and speaking, very similar within the electronic apparatus, as we can see, but there's a slight shift. And so communication scholars moving forward, which we all just got a nice semester preview of, we'll continually think about how these new forms of communication encourage us to look at the world in different ways. And so the shift in electronic formats between writing and speaking occur in the use of various communication codes. Now we have text, voice, sound, image, video, etc., which are now available to construct, create, right, and disseminate as a mediated and written context. And so you step into a context, you read the room, you slightly alter the table and the chair, and then you present a series of messages to a live audience. Well, all of that is going on within the electronic apparatus, but now you have control over many of these contextual forms of communication. Where do I put the board over here? What image do I put over here? Where's the lighting coming from in the room? And so now we can use the setting as a director to produce a message in and of itself. And a lot of us are looking at the different forms of messages that we are now privy to. How many of us have not been in a Zoom meeting or a Skype call or a WhatsApp exchange and not looked at the background, looked at the window or someone's living room, or looked at the weather or the time of day in another place? And why are we doing that? Because we are now now different forms of communication are made available to us, and they weren't before. Now we still have to concentrate on the message. What's the message here? The message is a meeting for work, but this person's in their living room and there's a movie that I really like on in the background. And so whether it's done on accident or on purpose, just like live communication, these elements communicate certain messages to us. And so we're seeing a slew of post-production and electronic shifts as we communicate in largely electronic platforms. And some of them are interesting and enjoyable. Others we count as noise. Pressing mute on your video camera is something that's very important now when you're in a large group context functioning online. And so once again, a dog or a baby or TV in the background, just like in those old school models of communication, constitute noise for the most part. Remember, noise, anything that hinders the reception of a message. And so the concept of post-production, which is not just a way that we edit media, but it's an entire concept. It alters the way that we look at originality and creation of messages. We are largely just using and reusing different texts and images to create new messages. And furthermore, those messages largely manipulate previous narratives that we might be familiar with, right? And so that's some of the issues there. How are we functioning as a class? How are we functioning as a community of friends and intellectuals and activists and practitioners now? And so the concept of post-production gives us the opportunity to become aware of the abilities to create, harness, and read this new electronic context as directors, actors, and critics. I can become a critic of myself as I'm speaking because I'm looking at myself speaking. And this is off-putting at first. I'm also considering my directorial choices. So much like a performance choice. Am I going to lift my hand here and lift the pad over here? It's a performance choice. But my directorial choice, why did I put the board over here, the blank wall in the background? I'm also becoming cognizant of and critical of as I am delivering this message. And so what happens to our thinking? That's the question here. One thing, our thinking becomes a little bit more dynamic, a little bit more fragmented. I'm thinking all of these things that are going on as I'm speaking. And so if I was in a traditional live setting, I wouldn't necessarily be thinking about two of those elements. That directorial element is not as present as it would be in the electronic apparatus. They don't have the ability to create every setting or stage, if you will, when I'm speaking in live environments. And so the concept of post-production allows us to recognize how we are negotiating previous narratives as well. And so if you're a community of practitioners and you meet up somewhere and that's where you meet, and then you engage in a series of community performances, well, how does it look now? If we're used to going to class, we're used to talking to our neighbors in class, sharing notes, talking one-on-one with the professor. What does it look like now? If we're used to borrowing a textbook or reading a textbook and marking pages, what does it look like to read that textbook online and to contemplate the content of that textbook? And so a lot has changed. Thank you, everybody, for a wonderful semester, and congratulate yourselves. Most likely we can't gather in big gatherings and have a party to celebrate our collective hard work, but you can communicate with others, and hopefully you're finding some sort of space to reflect back on the semester and congratulate yourselves for a job well done as we ride off into the sunset of summer here. Lastly, we might think about a few things that were positive. I don't have a stack of papers this big in my home or office now. And so we have made a much smaller impact on the environment in terms of our use of resources. And so that has been very interesting. We haven't gone back and forth and commuted back and forth between home, work, and school. And so taking all those cars off the road and reducing some of our carbon footprints has been positive. Ideally, this should have left us more time to be, as Marshall McLuhan said, the thinking human, the literate human, the one that is isolated, alone by themselves, and not in a negative way, but in a positive way, alone, left to communicate or to contemplate the world and contemplate the reality that we live in. This is the literate human. And so even as if you're watching a video at home or reading news online, you're largely left to your own literate devices where you are part author and part reader. And so because of this isolation and this separation, ideally, we should have had more time to contemplate life. And so we should be intellectually a little bit more capable now because we've had this time. And so I encourage everybody to embrace some of the time that we also might have in the future to contemplate the world and think like that Marshall McLuhan literate human reading the distanced text of others. And then every once in a while, we might produce our own and disseminate that to a larger audience. And so the last question of the semester, think about how you are communicating, writing, and speaking within the electronic apparatus and who you're disseminating these messages to and why. And so finally, email me answers to that question just for extra credit. I'd like to congratulate everybody once again for completing a semester with a few obstacles in it, and stay intellectually engaged with your lives. And I hope to see everybody back next semester, whether we are in the electronic apparatus or in a more traditional face-to-face setting. All of these communication elements will continue to be relevant and resonate with our own lives here in the public sphere. And so once again, congratulations. And for those that are graduating, extra congratulations. And for those that are coming back, looking forward to seeing you next semester. Adios.